It is the most twisted crime story in New Mexico. The nightmarish details right out of a Hollywood script.
A sex torture chamber dubbed Satan's Den.
Well, a search is on today for the bodies of possible murder victims of the state's most infamous torture tyrant, David Parker Ray.
The following is a re-recording of the audio tape that David Parker Ray played for his victims. Caution, this is extremely unsettling.
Hello there, bitch. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal under the circumstances. For a little while at least, you need to get your shit together and listen to this tape. It is very relevant to your situation. I'm going to tell you in detail why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you, and how long you'll be here. I don't know the details of your capture because this tape is being created July 23rd, 1993 as a general advisory tape for future female captives. The information I'm going to give you is based on my experience dealing with captives over a period of several years. If, at a future date, there are any major changes in our procedures, the tape will be upgraded. Now, you are obviously here against your will, totally helpless, don't know where you're at, don't know what's going to happen to you. You're very scared or very pissed off. I'm sure that you've already tried to get your wrists and ankles loose and know you can't. Now you're just waiting to see what's going to happen next.
March 22nd, 1999. Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. A naked woman runs down a dusty road, a metal collar around her neck trailing a 6-foot chain. She bursts into a mobile home, desperate for help. Her name is Cynthia Vigil, and she's just escaped from hell. The phone call to the police went something like this. Yes, I'm calling for a young lady that ran into the house saying she'd been raped. She's got a chain on her and everything. Please send someone right away. This lady is naked and everything else. She said they've been holding her for 3 days. What police would discover at the home of David Parker Ray would shock even the most hardened investigators. A $100,000 custom-built torture chamber he called his toy box. Audio tapes describing unimaginable acts, and evidence suggesting decades of undiscovered victims. David Parker Ray's path to becoming one of America's most sophisticated serial killers began in Belen, New Mexico, 1939. Born into poverty, Ray's early life was marked by instability and violence. His parents separated when he was young, leaving him to bounce between relatives who either couldn't or wouldn't care for him properly.
The pattern we see in Ray's childhood is classic: social isolation, early exposure to abuse, and a complete lack of stable attachment figures. But what makes his case unique is how he channeled these experiences into methodical, calculated violence.
By his teenage years, Ray had developed an obsession with pornography and bondage magazines. His high school classmates remembered him as a loner who spent hours sketching elaborate torture devices in his notebooks. These weren't just adolescent fantasies. They were blueprints for what would come. After dropping out of high school, Ray joined the U.S. Army. His military service would prove crucial to his development. Here he learned discipline, structure, and most importantly, how to maintain a convincing facade of normalcy. He served as a mechanic, developing technical skills that would later prove essential to his crimes. After leaving the Army in 1960, Ray returned to New Mexico, where he began working as a maintenance mechanic. He married 4 times over the next 2 decades, each relationship marked by allegations of domestic violence and sexual abuse. Co-workers from this period described him as methodical, skilled, and eerily calm under pressure.
He could fix anything, had this way of breaking down complex problems into simple steps. Never got flustered. Looking back now, that same mechanical thinking, that's how he approached his victims.
Between 1960 and 1995, Ray worked at various state facilities, including parks, hospitals, and maintenance departments. Each job provided him with new skills and resources. He learned about sedatives while working at a hospital, studied electrical systems during his time with the Parks Department, mastered metalworking and maintenance roles. Every job was like a training ground. He wasn't just working, he was learning, gathering knowledge he'd use to build his torture chamber. The level of planning was unprecedented. By the late 1970s, Ray had established himself in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. He chose the location carefully, a small town surrounded by vast desert and the sprawling Elephant Butte Lake. To his neighbors, he was just another local mechanic. But women had already started disappearing. The first confirmed disappearances began around 1978, but we believe he started much earlier. Young women would vanish from bars, truck stops, and parking lots along Route 25. Some were reported missing. Many weren't. Ray's first documented victim was a 19-year-old hitchhiker who disappeared in 1981. Her body was never found, but investigators would later find her photograph in Ray's collection. She was smiling in the picture, unaware she was being photographed by her future killer. Ray's transformation from predator to master manipulator happened gradually. He began spending time in local bars, studying how other men would pick up women. But Ray wasn't interested in one-night stands. He was developing a system, testing different approaches, learning what worked. What set Ray apart was his patience. He might watch a potential victim for weeks, learning their habits, their vulnerabilities. He kept detailed notes on dozens of women, their schedules, their relationships, whether they had family in the area. It was reconnaissance on an unprecedented scale. In 1983, Ray began construction on what would become the toy box. Using skills learned from various maintenance jobs, he converted an ordinary aluminum trailer into a soundproof chamber of horrors. The project would take nearly 3 years and cost over $100,000. Inside the toy box, Ray had developed an elaborate system of psychological torture. The process began the moment a victim regained consciousness, with his recorded introduction playing through hidden speakers. The tape ran for 18 minutes, describing in clinical detail exactly what would happen to them.
You're going to serve as a sex slave. You're going to be kept naked and chained up like an animal. You'll be fed like an animal, out of a dog bowl. And you'll be treated like an animal when you disobey.
The recording wasn't just about creating fear. It was designed to break down the victim's sense of identity, to dehumanize them before the physical torture began. Ray understood that psychological manipulation was as powerful as physical pain. The toy box itself was divided into sections, each designed for specific forms of torture. The main chamber contained the modified gynecological chair, equipped with electrical connections and restraints. A separate area housed Ray's extensive collection of custom-made implements, each carefully maintained and cataloged. Ray's methods of disposal were as methodical as his abductions. He created a detailed map of Elephant Butte Lake, marking specific locations based on depth and underwater terrain. Bodies were weighted down with engine parts from his mechanic shop, carefully selected to resist corrosion. The lake was perfect for hiding evidence. 42 miles long, up to 200 feet deep in places, with underwater caves and crevices. Plus, the water's so murky that visibility is often less than a foot. He knew exactly what he was doing when he chose this location. Ray kept meticulous records of his crimes, documenting each victim in journals using a complex coding system. FBI analysts would later discover that specific symbols indicated disposal locations, while others referenced whether victims had family likely to report them missing. An investigator stated, quote, "We found lists going back decades. Each entry was marked with symbols, dates, and locations. Some had additional notes about victim characteristics. He treated it like a business, complete with inventory management. Looking back, we missed so many red flags. Women had been reporting similar stories for years. A police officer, a medical exam table, torture devices. But the victims were often addicts or sex workers. Their accounts were filed away, disconnected dots we failed to connect." The investigation revealed Ray's extensive preparation for law enforcement and intervention. He had a prepared explanation for everything in the toy box, claiming it was for consensual adult films. He kept signed consent forms in his files, documents he forced victims to sign under torture. A prosecutor said, quote, "This wasn't just about hiding bodies. He created an entire cover story, complete with documentation. Every tool had a supposedly legitimate purpose. Every modification to the trailer had a plausible explanation. He thought through every detail." Cynthia Vigil's escape was different. During her 3 days of captivity, she had managed to memorize details of the property, carefully observing her captor's routines. When Hendy forgot to secure her restraints properly, Vigil seized her chance. She waited until Ray left for work. Hendy was distracted, had left a key within reach. Vigil managed to grab it, unlock her chains, and fight her way past Hendy. The fact she kept the collar and chain as evidence, that was crucial. It proved she wasn't making this up. When police arrived at Ray's property, they found Hendy attempting to clean the toy box. But there was too much evidence to hide. Bloodstains, hair samples, Polaroid photos, and most damaging, Ray's extensive collection of video recordings. The video evidence was overwhelming. Ray had recorded some of his torture sessions, apparently for his own enjoyment. The tapes showed multiple victims, multiple accomplices. It completely destroyed his consensual acts defense. As the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit began studying Ray's recordings and journals, they uncovered disturbing patterns that went beyond the physical torture. The tapes revealed someone who understood human psychology at a predatory level. His introductory recording wasn't random rambling. It was a carefully crafted psychological tool. He would tell victims exactly how long they'd been unconscious, what drugs were in their system, even details about their families. This created a sense that he was all-knowing, all-powerful. Ray's journals contained detailed psychological profiles of his victims. He documented their breaking points, their fears, even their moments of resistance. Each entry was clinical, detached, like a scientist recording experimental data. In one journal entry, he wrote about a victim's response to hearing her child's name mentioned. He noted how quickly she became compliant after that. He wasn't just sadistic. He was studying his victims, learning how to break them more efficiently. The investigation also revealed Ray's network extended beyond his immediate accomplices. Local business owners had unknowingly helped him target victims. Motel owners would alert him when young women checked in alone. Bar staff would point out vulnerable targets. He'd built this invisible web of informants. Most didn't know what they were really involved in. He'd present himself as a concerned citizen, maybe claim he was watching out for drug activity. He manipulated the whole community. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered Ray had maintained detailed financial records of his operation. Receipts for equipment, modifications to the toy box, even a ledger tracking expenses for drugs and disposal materials. He spent over $100,000 on the toy box alone. Custom hydraulics, medical equipment, surveillance systems. Everything was paid for in cash, spread across different suppliers to avoid suspicion. This wasn't just a hobby. This was his life's work. The investigation expanded across multiple states as connections to cold cases began emerging. FBI analysts identified potential Ray victims in Texas, Arizona, and Colorado. Each case followed a similar pattern: young women disappearing from areas where Ray had worked or lived.
We started looking at missing persons cases dating back to the 1950s. Women who matched his victim profile, who disappeared along routes he frequently traveled. The numbers were staggering. We identified 62 cases with strong connections to Ray.
Ray's employment history became a roadmap of disappearances. During his time working at state parks, women vanished from campgrounds. When he worked hospital maintenance, female patients went missing. At each location, he had access, authority, and an alibi. One of the most disturbing discoveries was his collection of identity documents: driver's licenses, social security cards, student IDs, all belonging to women who had never been found. Each one represented a life erased, a family left without answers. In Ray's workshop, investigators found tools modified specifically for torture. He had taken ordinary mechanical equipment and transformed it into instruments of unimaginable cruelty. Each device showed signs of repeated use and careful maintenance. The level of craftsmanship was chilling. He'd created custom electrical devices, modified medical instruments. Everything was precisely engineered. He'd even kept maintenance logs, recording which tools were used on which victims. But perhaps most disturbing were the photographs. Hundreds of them, carefully organized and dated. Some showed victims before their abduction, taken without their knowledge. Others documented their time in the toy box. Many of the women in these photos have never been identified. Building a case against Ray presented unique challenges. Many victims were dead or missing. Others were too traumatized to testify. The prosecution would have to rely heavily on physical evidence and the testimony of his accomplices.
We had this mountain of physical evidence. The toy box itself, the tools, the recordings. But Ray had an explanation for everything. He claimed it was all for consensual BDSM films. We needed his accomplices to break the case wide open.
Cindy Hendy was the first to crack. Facing multiple life sentences, she agreed to testify against Ray. Her detailed accounts of their crimes horrified the courtroom. She described their methodical hunting process, the torture sessions, and the disposal of bodies. Hendy testified for 6 days. She described how they would evaluate potential victims, looking for women without strong family ties. She talked about how Ray would time the torture sessions, treating them like experiments. The jury was visibly shaken. Jessie Ray's testimony proved equally damaging to her father's defense. She revealed how he had groomed her from childhood, slowly normalizing his sadistic behavior until she became an unwilling participant in his crimes.
Jessie's testimony was crucial because it showed the long-term manipulation. She described how Ray would test people, pushing boundaries gradually, until they were completely under his control. It helped explain how he'd managed to create this network of accomplices.
Roy Yancey's confession about Marie Parker's murder provided the only body investigators would ever find. His testimony detailed how Ray had orchestrated the disposal of victims, using his knowledge of the desert landscape to hide remains.
Yancey led us to Parker's remains. He remembered the exact location, because Ray had made him memorize it. That was Ray's method. Every detail planned, Every participant carefully controlled.
After weeks of testimony, the horrifying scope of Ray's operation became clear. Not just the murders themselves, but the intricate system he had built over decades. A system designed not just to kill, but to make people disappear without a trace. What made this case unique wasn't just the number of victims. It was the level of organization, the attention to detail, the careful planning that went into every aspect. Ray hadn't just committed crimes, he had perfected them. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. David Parker Ray was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 224 years in prison, but Ray would serve less than 1 year of his sentence. On May 28, 2002, he died of a heart attack in prison. He took the locations of countless victims to his grave. Cindy Hendy received 36 years, Jesse Ray 9 years, and Roy Yancey 20 years for their roles in the crimes. But the true body count may never be known.
The lake keeps its secrets. Every few years, when the water level drops, we go back and search. Sometimes I think about those families, still waiting for answers. Still wondering if their loved ones met their end in Ray's toy box.
Today, the case of the Toy Box Killer has fundamentally changed how law enforcement investigates disappearances in the American Southwest. Every missing persons case carries the weight of Ray's shadow. What makes this case so significant isn't just the horror of his crimes. It's how someone could operate on this scale, in plain sight, for so long. He was literally winning employee awards while torturing women in his backyard. The toy box itself was destroyed by the FBI, but Elephant Butte Lake remains. A vast watery grave that may hold answers we'll never find. Ray wasn't just a killer. He was a psychological architect. Everything was designed. The location, the tools, the tapes, even his public persona. He created a perfect system for evil. In Truth or Consequences, locals still whisper about Ray's crimes. His property has been demolished, but the questions remain. How many victims? How many families still wonder? How many answers lie beneath these waters? Sometimes, the darkest mysteries aren't about what we find. They're about what remains hidden, beneath the surface, beyond our reach, forever unsolved.